All right, so today we're going to be introduced to probably one of the most important concepts in this unit, really, maybe one of the most important concepts throughout this entire class. It is called the demographic transition model. So it's related to a lot of what we've been talking about in class, and a lot that has to do with population statistics. So to start off with, I want to think about the actual title, the words that are in the demographic transition model. So demographic means related to the study of population, and transition means how something changes. So what we are looking at when we talk about the demographic transition model is kind of the change in population structures for individual countries. So thinking about how the changing population structure is related to development and all of the different social and developmental indicators that we've been talking about all week. So on your foldable that you made up the other day, I'm going to have you label stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4 because those are the commonly known 4 stages of the demographic transition. So in those, you're going to be writing characteristics and country examples. All right, so let's start by taking a look at the demographic transition model. So this is what it typically looks like. This is the first of kind of many models that we will talk about. And models are going to be useful ways to look at different social and economic phenomena in each kind of in individual countries. So in this one, like I said, we're talking about population change and how it is how the structure within an individual country will change as that country develops. So the 3 statistics that you are going to be keyed in on are birth rate, death rate, and then total population. And as we've talked about, the difference between birth and death rate divided by 10 equals the natural increase rate. So natural increase is going to be something that we talk about as we get into stages 2 and 3. So essentially what we are looking at in this model is talking about kind of pre-industrial stages for countries, what happens as countries go through industrialization, and what countries look like in post-industrial stages. And basically a way to correlate this are less developed countries, developing countries, and more developed countries. All right, so we will start with a stage that no country in the world is still in, and that is called stage 1. So what is happening in stage 1 is that within a country or within a geographic territory, birth rates and death rates are still really high. So what that might mean are that countries still have high rates of disease and infant mortality and things that essentially would serve as checks or would serve as things that would cause the death rate to be continuously high within the country. So what that means basically is that population increase is not occurring, not going to occur at all. As countries start to develop and start to industrialize, what we start to see is the death rate goes down. The birth rate eventually will fall to meet the death rate. And that countries will go through essentially a process of development as it relates to both their population structure and as it relates to other things within the country. So you can see a little bit about what's happening within each kind of individual stage. We'll talk about that later. And one thing you'll notice as it goes through the entire transition, total population within the country will rise significantly. So let's get into it and let's talk about individual stages. So we're not going to spend a ton of time in stage 1. As we talked about before, no country in the world is still in stage 1. So where I said country example, you can write the word none. So birth rates high, death rates high, high infant mortality and fertility rates. So these are countries that really have high rates of communicable disease, other things like famine and environmental and social checks on population growth that are oftentimes really bad things, right? So thinking about stage 1, most of the world has been in what kind of a state of stage 1-ness for much of human history. So thinking specifically something like the Black Death pandemic that killed lots and lots of people, you don't see, and you have concurrently not seen population grow significantly for much of human history. Not even approaching a billion until around the 1800s. So what happens as we start to see industrialization is that countries start to go through a process of demographic transition. So that'll take us into where we are going to see a lot of countries. Stages 2 and 3. So as I said before, a good way to think of it, and this is not 100% accurate, but it's pretty close, is that stage 2 countries are going to be mostly less developed countries. Stage 3 countries are going to be mostly developing, and stage 4 are going to be mostly more developed countries. There's a few interesting outliers, China being the most notable one, but we'll talk a lot about that in class. All right, so thinking about what happens to a country as it enters stage 2. The most important thing, and I'm going to go back to this screen to show you, the most important thing that happens in stage 2 is the death rate begins to fall. And that's sort of what starts this entire process. So why does the death rate begin to fall? Well, the country or the geographic territory starts to get basic medical and social interventions. So things that to us seem relatively simple, but having kind of basic forms of medicine, basic forms of sanitation, basic forms of dealing with disease in ways that humans essentially didn't have before the year 1750 or so, starts to lead in a big decrease in things like infant mortality rates, which oftentimes can lead to a decrease in things like fertility rates. So you see a decrease in infant mortality, you see a decrease in disease, and you start to see death rates begin to fall. So what we often see is birth rates are still pretty high. So all of that in between is population growth. So you start to see very, very rapid population growth happening within these countries. So stage 2 is marked by falling death rates and very rapid population growth, as well as some of these other things that you see here. So an example of a country that would still be in stage 2 would be the Central African Republic. And this is chock full of things that we will talk about later. But these are some of the statistics that that we have looked at in class. So you can pause for a second and just kind of see where a country that we would consider very, very kind of poor by 2020 standards, or definitely falling into the less developed category, would fall in terms of statistics and its population pyramid. So stage 2 countries. All right, so now we're going to think about stage 3. So I like to go back to this big one just to talk about it a little bit. So in stage 2, we saw the death rate begin to fall. So what do we see happening in stage 3 is that the birth rate starts to fall to match the death rate. So that's probably one of the most important facets of stage 3 is falling birth rate, basically, to match the death rate. And what we also see with that is that population still going up. Maybe not quite as rapidly as it is in stage 2, but still significantly going up. So birth rate begins to fall to match death rates. The death rates are already low as a result of kind of falling within the previous stage. And population is still increasing, but not quite at the 2% or the 3% that we saw in stage 2. So you see declining rates of natural increase, like we just talked about. You also see declining infant mortality and total fertility rates, and longer life expectancies. So we see a lot of social and economic improvements in these countries that oftentimes simultaneous to this process of going into stage 3 are going through economic industrialization. And those two go hand in hand often. So a country example for this would be India. So you can kind of see a little bit how the statistics are different for a country like India, where we have a birth rate of 20, death rate of 6, and a natural increase rate of about 1.4, as opposed to Central African Republic, which I think was, let's see, about 3.5, right? So much growing, but still growing at a much less rapid pace than the Central African Republic. And life expectancy is starting to creep into a range that is closer to more developed countries as well. So India is a country that would firmly be in stage 3, and oftentimes is the best example for a stage 3 country that you'll see. All right, so kind of zooming back to the other one, stage 4. So what we see in stage 4 is that essentially birth rates have fallen to be low enough to be a kind of low with the death rates. That's not a great way to explain it. So let's see what I said. Yeah, so birth rates are low, death rates are low, and therefore population growth has almost entirely slowed. So population growth has started to level off. So if we're looking for stages of the demographic transition where we don't see population growth, stage 1, we don't see much, and stage 4, we don't see much. But for entirely different reasons. So other characteristics, we have low rates of natural increase, oftentimes below 0.5%, or sometimes even into the negatives as countries start to have birth rates that permanently are lower than death rates and maybe start to decrease in population. Low infant mortality rates, low total fertility rates, oftentimes below 2.2 or 2.1, and higher life expectancies. So these are countries that we would often call more developed countries. An example of that would be South Korea, a country that is kind of entered stage 4 probably sometime in the early 90s, and at this point has a population that I think is projected to go through this and essentially start to decrease at some point in the next 20 or 30 years. All right, so South Korea is our stage 4 country. So one more time, let's see, things to know. Essentially, what you should know is the connection between population statistics and the demographic transition model. So you have to kind of know what's going on in each stage, and it can take a while to get that down. So we'll do a lot of practice, but this is a good, important to kind of make sure that you're focused in on, well, what's happening as a country is less developed, what's happening as a country goes through development, what's happening as a country is more developed, and how does that relate to each type of population statistic. So that's kind of the first thing to know. The second one are the stages of the demographic transition itself. What's happening in each country in each stage? What are some things that go on economically, medically, and kind of socially as well? So we'll talk a lot about that in class. All right, thanks.